6 zeros, diving from 13,000 feet. Closer every second angle of attack, 13 degrees. Closure speed, 312 mph. Below them, a single .1 F6F Hellcat. 12,000 feet, 22% fuel left. Pilot alone on combat air patrol, no escort, no radio. He has 12 seconds until the first zero reaches guns range 400 yards and shrinking. The Hellcat was never supposed to outturn a zero. Too heavy, too blunt. Even instructors said you'll never win the circle. Climb or die. Rudder rolls were forbidden above 10,000 feet. Compressibility risk, tail stalls, structural stress, but in this moment, the pilot pulls full throttle, kicks left rudder, and initiates the forbidden move, a Torque-Burst Rudder Flare. It was banned for a reason. The zero pilot fires, misses, overshoots. Another tries to cut, loses visual. A third stalls in the roll. In just 90 seconds, 6 coordinated attacks fall apart. 1 Hellcat survives. Japanese command had dismissed the F6F as predictable, vertical bound, but after this tape, they reevaluated everything. Leyte Gulf, October 1944, carrier cap over transport lanes, and the manuals said the rudder flare was suicidal. The F6F Hellcat was born out of panic and steel. When it first appeared in 1943, its job was simple: stop the zero. On paper, it had the muscle, 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber Brownings, armor plating, and a top speed of 300 mph in level flight. But early pilots didn't trust it. It weighed over 12,000 pounds, fully loaded more than twice the Zero's mass. Its massive Grumman frame took flak well, but in turns, it felt like trying to pivot a battleship. From the start, fighter instructors issued one order again and again: do not try to outturn a Zero. You'll lose. It wasn't fear, it was physics. The Zero's wing loading was just 18 Elb FT2. The Hellcat's was over 32. In a level circle at 280-mile map, the Zero could complete a 360-degree turn in 17.3 seconds. The F6F took nearly 23 seconds. Even with combat flaps, the gap was clear. Memos from Naval Air Training Command, dated early 1944, repeated the warning: rudder input at speed must remain coordinated. Cross control above 10,000 feet leads to flap flutter, tail stall, or asymmetric yaw. And yet, whispers spread. A test pilot flying out of Pearl Harbor in mid-1943 had attempted a hard left flare at 270 mph, rudder full deflection, nose down, elevators trimmed neutral. The plane didn't spin, it didn't turn, it skidded. A partial yaw-roll. For 0.8 seconds, the Hellcat twisted 20 degrees sideways before recovering. The pilot logged the entry as unexpected rudder-induced lateral stall. Command reviewed the report and wrote a single word across the margins: unsafe. That maneuver, unofficially called the Torque-Burst Rudder Flare, was never added to tactical doctrine. The airflow behavior was unpredictable, especially at altitude. One mistake, one cross-control under pressure, and the heavy airframe would roll with the torque, not against it. Some engineers feared it could shear a wingtip off in the right wind shear. Carrier qualification instructors added a line to every flight syllabus: do not flare roll above 10,000 feet. But not everyone followed that line. In late 1944, a Marine pilot flying close air support near the Philippines claimed he dodged a pair of Oscars by yanking left and hammering the rudder, causing one to overshoot and one to stall out. He was laughed off until his wingman backed him up. Both were told not to repeat it. The Hellcat wasn't supposed to do that. Not by mass, not by shape, not by control logic. But in the cockpit, some pilots felt something different, that if you got the airspeed between 266 and 278 mph, kicked the rudder, and pitched with the torque curve just right, the Hellcat would slide. Not stall. That wasn't a turn. It was a break in geometry. But one misstep, 1 degree too far, and you'd spin. No one trained it, no one documented it, and no Japanese ace expected it because the Hellcat was supposed to fight vertical. Until that morning over Leyte, when a lone Hellcat pulled it on purpose. By early 1944, U.S. Naval air combat doctrine was blunt and inflexible. Never try to outturn a Zero, ever. The training emphasized vertical escapes, energy management, and boom and zoom tactics. The F6F Hellcat, with its 2,000 horsepower, Pratt & Whitney R2800 was designed for high-speed dives and high-altitude slashing attacks, not turn fights. The numbers backed it. The Zero could climb at 3,100 F-men under 10,000 feet. The Hellcat, though more powerful, only managed 2,900 L F-men when fully loaded. Worse, the F6F's turn radius at 200 MWII was around Os 400 yards, nearly 60% wider than the Agile Zero. If a Hellcat tried to follow a Zero in a sustained turn, it would bleed speed, stall early, and become a floating target. Wing loading was the key difference. The A6M20 carried just 18.5 lb-ft2 across its wing surface. The Hellcat's wing loading was 32.3 lb-ft2, meaning it needed more speed and space to generate the same lift. At a level turn, the Zero could maintain pressure longer, tighten faster, and outangle its opponent before the first tracers left the barrel. This doctrine wasn't suggestion, it was survival. Instructors drilled it mercilessly. Climb out, dive out, or die, but that rigidity left blind spots. One test report from NAS Patuxent River in late 1943 noted that when rudder was applied independently at 270, 280 mop, the F6F's nose would yaw rapidly up to 25 degrees before realigning. It also noted a brief lateral vibration, possibly torque oscillation from the massive engine. The report was marked inconclusive, and the behavior was considered a quirk, not an asset. In combat simulations, cross-control was deemed dangerous, above 10,000 feet. With thinner air, the chance of rudder stall or control surface lock increased. Tail flutter became a real concern. Engineers logged that above 12,000 feet, hard rudder deflection at speed could induce elevator lag of 1.5 seconds, long enough to ruin recovery. And yet, something kept surfacing in pilot chatter. Some Hellcat drivers swore that if you chopped throttle slightly, eased left stick, and kicked hard rudder at just the right speed, the aircraft would yaw flat for just long enough to shift your angle out of enemy guns. It wasn't a roll. It wasn't a coordinated turn. It was a side-slip flare, one that violated every rule in the manual. Still, no one taught it, no diagrams, no flight card, just stories. Meanwhile, Japanese command continued to assume the Hellcat was a blunt force weapon, deadly in a dive, predictable in a turn. They issued guidance to all Zero units in the Philippines: do not engage below. Bait them into climbing turns. They cannot pivot under pressure. On October 23, 1944, one F6F pilot proved them wrong. He entered a 6-on-1 scenario. No wingman. Altitude 12,000 feet. And when the first bracket came down at a closing angle of 70 degrees, he didn't dive, he didn't climb, he flared. At 08:42 local time, over the Leyte Gulf, the sky above a lone F6F Hellcat began to collapse. 6 A6M0s, flying in a fan-shaped combat pattern, executed a coordinated descent from 13,000 feet to 12,000 feet, diving in at a shallow 13-degree angle. The lead Zero call sign, Red 1, had spotted the F6F during a routine patrol loop and called the group into a converging attack geometry, known in IJN doctrine as a claw cage. Their timing was surgical. At 320 mph, their closure rate gave them just under 1.6 miles to the target, translating to 94 yards per second. The lead element had the high 6 o'clock, 2 flankers came in at 5 and 7, and the rear triangle fanned out to limit the Hellcat's dive escape. The Zero pilots expected a vertical break. It's what Hellcats always did. But late Thomas F. Merrick alone in his F6F tail number 4152 held his course. Altitude 11,980 feet, airspeed 287 mph, fuel 22% each, guns loaded 120 rounds total, all 6 50 calibers hot, at 1.1 miles. Red 1 opened fire too early. His 7.7 millimeter rounds fell short, but the signal was clear. The claw was closing. Merrick had 11 seconds before all 6 attackers would be inside firing range. He tilted left, then snapped level, baiting the lead Zero into tightening his turn arc. That moment cost the Zero altitude 200 feet lost, but it gained position. Now the 2 outer attackers from 5 and 7 o'clock mirrored each other, angle offset 70 degrees apart. They were positioning for bracketing fire, with Merrick in the kill funnel. Dive angle and forward vector would cross in 9.2 seconds. Merrick chopped throttle by 18%, bringing his speed to 273 mph, a typical mistake if he planned to turn. Zeros were faster in the roll at low throttle, but he wasn't turning yet. He angled his nose 3 degrees down, faked a dive initiation, then kicked left rudder just enough to slide his heading by 11 degrees. Red 1 fired again. His tracer burst 0.5 seconds was aimed at where the Hellcat should have been, but Merrick had shifted out of the cone. The round sliced harmlessly past his starboard wing. This wasn't just evasive, it was disorienting. Red 1 pulled hard left to stay on the tail, but in doing so, broke formation geometry. The lead vector fractured. The 5 other Zeros now had to adjust individually. By the next 4 seconds, distances had collapsed. 5 Zeros had entered 300-yard range, all approaching at different angles, but none with perfect gun solution. They were aiming based on turn lag. But Merrick wasn't turning. He was slipping. Firing range was now 250 yards. 1 more second, and the geometry would break completely. Unless Merrick made a full move now. At 246 yards, the lead Zero had guns on. His convergence angle was locked. Merrick had bled speed down to 271 mph, maintaining a near-level attitude. From the attacker's cockpit, it looked perfect. The Hellcat had no dive momentum, no turn arc, no vertical energy left to escape. But Merrick did the one thing doctrine forbade. He chopped throttle to 48%, yanked full right rudder, and pulled elevator neutral, holding the stick firm to avoid unbalancing roll. For a full 1.2 seconds, the aircraft twisted, not turning in the classic sense, but yawing through its own flight path. The tail skidded left, the nose drifted right, rotating 17 degree off vector, while losing only 28 mph of airspeed. To the Zero pilot, the F6F suddenly vanished from the predicted lead arc. The tracers missed by over 30 feet, despite perfect timing. He overshot. The first Zero went wide right, rolling over in confusion. The Hellcat didn't pursue. Merrick pushed throttle to 76%, gained 11 mph, and rolled shallow left to bleed visual alignment with the second attacker. But now the other Zeros were reacting. The fan formation became a knife fight. No more coordination, just angles. 02 came in from high left, descending at 310 mph. Angle offset 23 degrees, close enough to see Merrick's canopy. He fired early, 0.6 second burst. Merrick flared nose up 2 degrees, kicked opposite rudder, and held the flare roll for 0.9 seconds. Not enough to escape completely, but just enough to force a misfire. The rounds sliced above his right wing. No contact. But now he was bleeding energy. Speed dropped to 259 mph, a warning zone. The Hellcat's rudder authority dropped sharply below 260, and compressibility issues began to interfere with elevator response. 03 had learned. He rolled in from the low rear and didn't fire immediately. Instead, He paced Merrick 240 yards, waiting for the American to commit. Merrick leveled wings, pretending to dive. 03 anticipated the turn banked left. Merrick didn't turn. He flared again. This time left rudder. Throttle spike, elevator hold. But the maneuver stalled too soon. Airspeed 254 mph. Not enough cushion. The yaw angle only reached 11 degrees before flattening out. 03 corrected early, dipped nose, prepared to fire. Merrick rolled right hard, losing more speed. Just as 03 fired, the tracers passed behind him. Missed again. But now, the move was degrading. The Zeros had adjusted. They weren't pulling into old arcs. They were delaying, spacing, reacting to the yaw slide. That made it harder. Merrick had no room to improvise. Fuel 18% altitude, 140 FT speed, 251 mph. He had one move left before stall risk, and the next Zero number 4 was diving in from 5 o'clock high at 325 mile pay, too fast to overshoot, too slow to miss. Then one more flare failed to engage, and Merrick dropped into the danger zone. 04 didn't fire. He held formation just outside the Hellcat's arc, trailing 220 yards at 325 meters. Slightly high, nose trimmed for dive correction. His orders were clear: do not overshoot. Let the American turn, force the error. Japanese doctrine now treated the Hellcat's energy bleed like a trap, so 04 waited. Merrick saw it in his mirrors. The Zero wasn't rushing. No lead angle, no wild rudder, just steady gain. He tried a test slip right rudder, throttle chop, mild flare. The Zero didn't bite. He stayed offset, adjusting in real time. This was worse. Overshoots were survivable. Tracers that never came. That was deadly. Merrick's airspeed hovered at 253 ps, dangerously close to the stall onset for cross-control. High fuel was now 16%, right tank slightly lower. Oil temps rising 232 degrees left, 280 degrees right. He couldn't keep this tempo. 05 now joined on the left mirrored geometry, 210 yards off port, lower by 40 feet, climbing gently to lock a shot. Merrick was being boxed again, but not for a kill, for a forced stall. The Zeros had seen the flare. Now they were spacing for it. He needed to break the geometry again. Merrick kicked throttle to 84%, dove 5 degrees, building speed to 272 mph. Both Zeros corrected. He wasn't escaping them. They were conserving position. Their guns would only open when his airframe committed to a roll or hard flare. Then it came. 04 dropped 17 degrees, firing a 0.5-second burst at 310 yards. Not to kill, but to push Merrick into a reaction. He half-flared, shallow left, but aborted midway, a calculated fake. 05 moved too soon. He pulled lead, expected the slide, but Merrick held level. The shot missed wide left. Still, the pressure was mounting. 06 joined high rear, forming the tail cap. Merrick was now surrounded on 3 vectors, all within 240 yards, and they were learning. 04 fired again this time, delayed by 0.8 seconds after Merrick's rudder twitch. The Hellcat's nose skipped wide, but not wide enough. 2 tracers grazed the right wing root. Minor damage, but proof they had recalibrated. Merrick had seconds. The Zeros were waiting for flap lag, elevator compression, or rudder stiffening any sign of structural delay. He yanked throttle to 90%, pulled elevator gently, trying to bait altitude gain. The Hellcat climbed 60 feet. The Zeros surged to match, still not firing. This was a cage, and the Predator was now prey. At 10,980 FT, rudder resistance spiked. Stick pressure hardened. Aileron input delayed. Then 06 dipped nosedive angle, 16 degrees. Closing fast, prepared to fire, not into where the Hellcat was, but where it would slide into. They had learned the flare, and now they were aiming ahead of it. The airframe stiffened at 10,940 feet. Merrick's Hellcat was still in flight, but not in control. Rudder input lagged by 1.6 seconds. The elevator felt damp. Aileron resistance climbed. These were classic signs of onset control compression, a known hazard when heavy aircraft attempted aggressive maneuvering at mid-thin altitude. 06 pulled in close, angling from high 6 o'clock, distance 190 yards, speed 318 per mop, dive angle 15.5 Oscar. The kill window was seconds away. Merrick had only one move left in memory, full throttle. Snap flare, torque yaw input, but he was slow 246 mph when slightly nose up. That created the perfect storm, inadequate lift for lateral recovery. Full engine torque, straining the right wing, and a nose angle that threatened to break airflow across the tailplane. Still, he committed. He mashed left rudder, chopped throttle to 58%, and pulled elevator 3-degree nose up. The aircraft began to rotate, but the roll response outpaced the yaw. The result was an asymmetrical tumble. The F6F didn't flare, it twisted. The right wing dropped 11 degrees below horizon while the nose remained up. The tail began a flat yaw lift, a deadly stall indicator. Merrick countered with hard opposite, aileron. But the control stick pushed back. Aileron stiffness had fully engaged. He was fighting his own aircraft. Altitude 10, 720 feet. Speed 238 mph, 06 fired, 0.7 second burst. Rounds shredded across the starboard rear fuselage. 2 impacts hit the right elevator. The Hellcat jerked but held. No hydraulic loss. Now the real danger appeared spin entry. Merrick's nose swung violently left, the yaw exceeding 33 degrees, while roll authority vanished. The Hellcat entered a pre-stall skid. Nose high, wings tilting, tail rudder unresponsive. For 1.9 seconds, the aircraft was neither climbing nor diving, just floating in a chaotic plane between airflow vectors. This was the stall zone. Below him, 05 corrected and positioned for the kill. Merrick's only option was to force asymmetry. He slammed throttle to 100%, hoping the torque would roll the nose out. The big Pratt and Whitney roared, but that alone wouldn't be enough. So he did the one thing no manual advised. He kicked more rudder into the spin. Right pedal, hard full deflection for 0.7 seconds. That went against every flight school warning, but torque kicked in. The engines twist, combined with rudder bias and slipstream distortion, rolled the Hellcat back into airflow. It snapped level suddenly. Nose down 7 degrees, speed ticking up 247, 2F51, 2F58, wow, Mach. He had recovered, but lost altitude now 9,860 feet. And he'd been hit. Right elevator was partially severed. Rudder travel reduced, flareability compromised. The aircraft was intact but degraded. The Torque-Burst Flare was no longer an option. He was still surrounded. Fuel, 13%, ammunition, 620 rounds remaining. The Zeros had seen him stall, twist, and fall. Now they closed again tighter. And this time, they wouldn't leave room to roll. What Merrick had pulled intentionally and by accident was a maneuver never written down, never diagrammed, and almost never survived. It was informally called the Torque-Burst Rudder Flare, a hybrid of rudder deflection, engine torque exploitation, and throttle spike. It wasn't a coordinated turn, it wasn't a slide, it was a timed break in flight geometry, using the Hellcat's greatest weakness mass to pivot out of attack vectors. To understand it, you start with the engine. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp produced over 2,000 horsepower, generating over 2,600 ft-lbf of torque at full throttle. That force constantly twisted the airframe clockwise from the pilot's perspective, especially in steep climbs or acceleration phases. Most flight schools taught students to correct for it. What no one taught was how to use it. If a pilot applied full throttle while kicking rudder hard in the same direction as torque rotation, and pitched nose up between 2° 4 degrees. The torque could momentarily assist yaw-roll, causing the entire fuselage to skip sideways across airflow vectors, not drift, not slide, skip for less than a second. The aircraft's direction of travel and direction of nose alignment separated by up to 22 degrees. The maneuver required a perfect entry window airspeed between 266 to 278 mph throttle spike from 60% to 95% within 0.4 seconds, rudder deflection full input for 0.8 1.2 seconds, pitch angle no more than 4 degrees nose up, or the flare would stall. The maneuver relied on airflow inertia. The sudden increase in torque plus rudder created asymmetric lift, which, in a lighter aircraft, would have caused a spin. But the Hellcat's weight, over 12,000 lbs, slowed the rotation just enough to delay the stall and hold position. There was no margin for error. If the pilot pulled rudder too early, the yaw would misalign and destabilize the ailerons. If pitch exceeded 6 degrees, the aircraft would snap roll and likely enter flat spin. If airspeed dropped below 260 mph, rudder stiffening would prevent recovery. And if torque wasn't rising, no throttle spike, the flare would simply yaw the aircraft sideways and expose the broad fuselage to enemy fire. That's why it was banned. That's why instructors hated it. But when executed perfectly, the maneuver did three things. 1, broke gunnery cones. Enemy pilots aiming for turn arcs found their targets vanished mid-lead. 2, delayed overshoots. Attackers expecting continued roll found the Hellcat, skidding left or right unexpectedly. 3, created false exits. The flare's endpoint forced enemies to assume the Hellcat had begun a dive or turn, triggering mistimed corrections. On paper, it was insane. In the sky, it was the only way out once. Merrick had already used it twice. On the third, it failed. And now, he couldn't trust the aircraft to do it again. Rudder response was reduced, elevators damaged, roll lag increasing. The maneuver was gone, but the enemy was not. 3 zeros were forming up again, 9,700 feet, 260 yards, tightening the noose. Merrick had seconds. This time, he needed something more than torque. He needed a sequence, one they hadn't seen. At 9,700 feet, with 3 zeros boxing him from rear high and flanks, Merrick's Hellcat was degraded. Right elevator response lagged by 0.5 seconds. Rudder return spring was sluggish. Full deflection now took 30% more pedal pressure. Fuel sat at 11%. Oil temp held at 204.1 digs, and airspeed stabilized at 263 mph, barely above the danger zone. He couldn't flare again, not the way he had. But what he still had was timing. 04 took the lead again. He dove shallow 14 degrees and began a slow roll left to cut off Merrick's escape arc. From his position, he expected the American to pull nose up and try another half-turn. He prepared to fire. 05 and 06 lagged to port and starboard, spacing themselves at 230 and 240 yards. A fan trap to catch any lateral roll. This was the kill cage. No dive escape, no flare room. Unless Merrick did something they didn't have a counter for a 3-phase torque sequence. He opened with a full throttle spike, jumping from 62% to 100% in 0.3 seconds, forcing a torque roll. The Hellcat twisted 4 degrees right, not enough to evade, but enough to bait 04's correction. The 0 banked sharper, closed in. Merrick chopped throttle instantly to 42%, causing torque bleed. Then he kicked left rudder hard, but only for 0.6 seconds, just enough to yaw the nose off, heading by 17, without inducing stall. Now came the risk reverse roll at partial throttle. He pushed right stick while holding neutral elevator, trying to flatten the Hellcat's nose just as the 0 opened fire. Tracer streak 0.5 seconds. Too late. Merrick's partial roll had shifted his profile down and away rounds past high. 3, 2, He pulled elevator 2 nose up, tapped left rudder again, and floored the throttle. The aircraft lurched, rotated slightly sideways. The slipstream kicked up off his port wing. 05 adjusted to fire only to see the Hellcat disappear below his vector. 1. Merrick fired 0.6-second burst, 200 rounds, a blur, a wing. 06 had swung too wide to follow. His wingtip crossed the Hellcat's nose path at 140 yards. Merrick's burst struck the underside 4 impacts. Fuel line hit. Explosion. Right wing engulfed. 06 spiraled downward, flaming. 04, now above and behind, tried to compensate. He pulled up to avoid debris overshot. Merrick flipped right, dove 8°, building speed fast, 267, 278, 284 MERE. 05 hesitated. Merrick turned left shallow, at 6° air bank, just enough to appear vulnerable. 05 dived in to finish it. Merrick kicked right rudder hard, 0.9 seconds. Nose yawed wide, faked to stall. 05 fired, missed. Merrick rolled inverted. 05 passed under him, briefly exposed. Merrick leveled, dropped nose, locked fire, 0.7-second burst. Another 180 rounds, hit, smoke. Damage not fatal, but disabling. 05 peeled off, trailing black. Now only 10 remained. Merrick leveled at 9 or 80 feet. Fuel at 9% speed, 296 pennicoits. The last 0 circled wide, never re-engaged, and then he vanished from view. No further contact was made. 6 zeros had entered. None remained on his tail. Merrick's cockpit was quiet, but far from calm. The Hellcat's frame was vibrating at irregular intervals, a clear sign of rudder asymmetry from earlier torque loading. The right elevator remained functional, but surface response was delayed and sluggish. He tapped the pedal. Feedback lagged 1.2 seconds. Worse, his instrument cluster blinked a low fuel warning, 9% remaining, enough for barely 12 minutes of sustained throttle at cruise. He rolled level at 9,040 feet, scanning for any remaining enemies, no contacts, but the threat wasn't gone, not yet. Oil temps had risen to 243 degrees, and cylinder head temperatures hovered just under redline. He'd spent 90 seconds at full throttle, with 2 back-to-back rudder flares and an inverted roll, all maneuvers well outside standard cooling tolerances. He checked his ammo, 340 rounds left across 4 guns. Left outboard weapon had jammed. Right wing root gun showed abnormal feed rate. He had 1 good burst left, maybe 2. His oxygen was low. He'd been above 10,000 feet for most of the fight, and shallow breathing had crept in during high G pulls. Now, he had a choice. Climb and try to reach the main formation, or dive for cover and risk ground fire. He banked south toward the nearest U.S. formation. Coordinates estimated 34 miles away, but a slow climb would make him a target. He checked the horizon again, and that's when the real danger appeared. A new radar contact. No visual yet. But his IFF transponder had failed, probably from impact damage to the starboard fuselage. He was invisible to friendly air cover. If that contact was friendly, he'd be safe. If not, he'd be spotted as an isolated Hellcat with damaged control and no backup. Timed impact 90 seconds. Altitude 600 feet and falling. He called out 201, visual lost, possible tail hit, seeking vector west. Silence. His radio had gone dead. Battery indicator red. Now it was blind navigation. Merrick pushed the nose down 6 degrees, built speed to 311 miles, and initiated a shallow descent. It was his only option. Low and fast, through scattered cloud layers, was the safest path to the carrier lanes. The new contact hadn't closed yet, but he knew he could feel it, that if he stayed at altitude, his silhouette would be too visible. Fuel dropped to 7%. He'd have one climb left, just one if he needed it. But every second stayed on course would cost him range. Carrier ops had reported returning Hellcats needing at least 6% fuel margin to make approach waves, and his left tank gauge was bouncing between 3 to 4%. If he dove through clouds, he could disappear. If he stayed high, and the radar contact was hostile, he'd be visible, tracked, fired on. Then at 8,000 feet, the cloud deck thickened, and he had 10 seconds to decide stay level and risk re-engagement, or punch through and vanish. Merrick chose cloud. At 7,980 feet, he rolled left 5 degrees, dipped his nose to 9 degrees, and plunged into the vapor layer at 312 mph. Visibility dropped to 0. He couldn't see his own wingtips. Instruments flickered. For 16 seconds, he flew blind. No radar, no radio, and no horizon. Just needle, ball, and airspeed. His heading veered off course by 14 degrees before he corrected. At 5,400 feet, he emerged beneath the clouds, sight lines restored. Sea beneath. He scanned for friendlies. None in sight. He was alone, but alive. By the time he identified the U.S. task force, he was 9 miles west of original intercept coordinates. Fuel had dropped to 4% with engine sputters starting on the left magneto. He keyed his dead radio, nothing. He had no IFF. Carrier AA could fire on him. He needed a visual approach. He descended to 2,000 feet, cut throttle to 60% and wagged wings twice. The deck crews on the escort carrier USS Petrov Bay spotted him just as he entered the pattern. No flap deployment, no wave off. He went straight in. Touchdown speed, 98 mph. Tail hook down, cable caught. Hard stop, total fuel remaining 3%. Left tank, dangerously dry. Right tank, flickering empty. Deck crews rushed forward first to check for leaks, then for the pilot. His face was gray, breath fast, but he stepped out unaided. The Hellcat was scorched, slashed, and venting fluid from the right elevator root. Elevator cables showed fraying. Right rudder linkage bent 3 degrees off axis. The gun camera had run the whole time. They pulled the film. At debrief, Merrick said only 6 zeros. 1 broke, 2 damaged, 1 confirmed kill. The footage confirmed it. Kill 1 flaming wing detonation on 06, clearly visible on reel. Frame time 16:03:14. Kill 2 probable. 05 trailing heavy black smoke. Diving away with elevator flutter. The film also captured the maneuver. Twice, one in partial yaw, the other full deflection. The playback showed Merrick's aircraft yawing 20 degrees, skidding across tracer fire, then rolling inverted to escape. It stunned the room. Then it disappeared. Officially, the film was logged, but it was flagged unsanctioned maneuver. The report added that use of rudder-based flare sliding is not recommended at combat altitude due to stall risk and control lag. The reel was sent to Fleet HQ. Merrick never saw it again. 2 days later, the Hellcat was pulled from rotation structural inspection, cited stress cracks along starboard spars. The aircraft was stripped for parts. No formal commendation was issued. The Air Group commander gave Merrick 1 verbal note, fly the book next time. Merrick asked if the maneuver would be reviewed. He was told it's not in the manual. It didn't happen, but word had already spread. Other pilots had heard the chatter. Some had seen the footage before it was pulled. And by the next morning, 3 junior officers were already in the ready room, sketching what they called the flare slide. Merrick didn't draw, but he didn't deny it. By the second week of November 1944, the maneuver had no name, but it had whispers. In 3 different squadrons across 2 carrier groups. Hellcat pilots were already attempting what they loosely called the slide pivot, or flat skid. None of them were taught it, all of them had heard of the kid who skidded under 6 zeros. It wasn't in flight manuals. No diagrams, no films, just verbal accounts and cockpit memory. The F6F had always been thought of as a vertical fighter, a high-speed diver with the strength to absorb damage. But in ready rooms aboard the Petroff Bay, Essex, and Langley, junior pilots started asking quiet questions. How far can you yaw at 270? Do you lose lift if you pitch after the slip? What's the stall margin in a roll flare below 10,000? They weren't ignored. Unofficial tests began. In one training flight near Leyte, a pilot intentionally entered a yaw flare at 6,500 feet, held full rudder for 0.9 seconds, and noted 20-degree nose offset with no spin. He logged it as flat yaw arc test number 1. By December 1944, 12 pilots had attempted it in training flights. 8 succeeded, 3 stalled, 1 ditched on recovery. The success rate was 75%, but only under perfect throttle rudder pitch sequencing. Squadron instructors warned, "Try it once, try it clean. Never try it again in combat unless you're out of options." They couldn't stop it. On the Langley, a pilot began calling it the judo slide. On the Petroff Bay, it became the barrel break. Neither name stuck officially, but both appeared in flight notebooks recovered post-war. No one wrote reports, no one submitted film, but the ripples spread wider. In February 1945, an F4U Corsair pilot reported avoiding a head-on gun pass by using what he described as a Hellcat yaw trick to offset nose vector without turning. His kill was confirmed, but the maneuver logged as improvised rudder drift. Across the fleet, different instructors had different views. The air group aboard the Shamrock Bay banned it completely, claimed it encouraged reckless control handling, but on the Enterprise, a flight leader began teaching it off-record. Not as a maneuver, but as an emergency tool. A last card. No doctrine ever named it. No training syllabus included it. But Hellcat pilots whispered, "If you're boxed, flared, and out of dive slide, and if you lived, say nothing." The Hellcat Buno 4152 was officially struck from the Petroff Bay's roster on November 8, 1944. The final report cited rudder assembly fatigue, elevator cable stress fractures, and right spar torsion beyond acceptable tolerance. Total combat hours, 71.6. Final logged action survived 6-1 encounter, 1 confirmed kill. The aircraft was disassembled for salvage. No part of it flew again. Thomas F. Merrick was rotated off frontline duty 4 weeks later, after completing this tour. His combat record listed 3 confirmed aerial victories, 1 probable, and 0 combat losses. He never filed a commendation for the October 23rd engagement. No Navy Cross, no Distinguished Flying Cross. Just a quiet entry on his debrief: engaged multiple enemies, recovered, returned. He flew test aircraft stateside for the remainder of the war, briefly instructing Corsair pilots on torque control and non-standard rudder behavior. When asked in 1946 if the flare slide was intentional, he replied, "Half of it was. The other half was survival." He left the Navy in 1947, never flew combat again. But the maneuver, though unnamed, never fully vanished. In the Korean War, 2 F4U-5 pilots independently recorded enemy overshoots during brief yaw deflection, rollouts techniques suspiciously similar to Merrick's torque flare. Neither referenced doctrine, neither cited origin. By 1950, aviation manuals had begun cautioning against improper rudder use during evasive maneuvering at altitude, citing stall spin risks, but also admitting unconventional yaw dynamics may momentarily confuse lead pursuit. Still no mention of October 1944, still no name. Yet combat trainers across 2 decades quietly included 1 line in advanced syllabus notes: under extreme threat. Rudder yaw with pitch hold may produce unexpected offset pilot assumes full risk. That was it. The maneuver lived on not as a move, not as a chapter, but as a rumor pilots passed forward. No one taught it, but every war, someone found it. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, and sometimes, just like Merrick in a dead radio sky, boxed by enemies, out of turns, out of tricks, and down to one last unapproved move that should never have worked. Mission complete. If you're airborne and boxed in slide, but only once.